Hi, everyone. We're here today with Shape the System and talking to Victoria Fram, Village Capital. Hi, Victoria. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Just love to hear a little bit firstly about Village Capital, what you set up there, what that system that's operating in and how that's rethinking that system.
Yeah. So in fact, when we talk about what we do, we say Village Capital is reinventing the system to back the entrepreneurs of the future. And
Right.
for us, that's a future where business creates equity and long-term prosperity. So I love the name of your podcast and am glad to be the same boat as you are in wanting to envision a different future.
Yeah, and look, you guys have been pioneering this for a while, I think, and to put this in some context, the original kind of or initial thinking for ways that this kind of capital allocation works is it tends to be venture capitalists and seed stage funds and growth funds pretty focused on profit motives and pretty focused on a very small and narrow set of people and problems in certain markets. And to unpack how Village Capital is kind of rethinking that.
Yeah, so we have been doing this for a while. We're actually coming up this fall on our 10-year anniversary, which is a little bit shocking for us to believe, but we have been at it now in a number of different geographies and now for quite a number of years. And really, we set out at the beginning to address a few really fundamental problems in how early stage innovation is funded. As you rightly point out, I think a disproportionate amount of capital globally goes to things that we see as, kind of nice to have rather than need to have solutions in terms of the fundamental issue areas. We're looking at, I spend most of my time here in San Francisco, and it's really easy to find convenience-focused apps that will have, mega seed rounds get off the ground pretty easily. But a lot of the really fundamental social and environmental issues that we care about might have a lot more difficult time finding funding to back innovation.
Sure.
Not only that, but we see, very sort of homogenous type of founder typically have an easier time raising capital. And that tends to be somebody who's probably male, probably young, and probably sitting in a geography that's already very well capitalized. And we just don't think that that's the only profile of person that has a great idea or the potential to build a great business. And we're trying to do things differently so that we make some progress towards the first goal of really solving the problems that matter, and then definitely make some progress towards the second goal, which is focused on opportunity being available to meet everybody's potential.
Sure. And in fact, you use a very specific word there, which I want to pick up on, where you talked about building a great business. And I think part of the starting point here is to challenge our notion of what a great business is. How do you think about what makes a great business from your lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most fundamental piece clearly is we want something that finds product market fit with customers. So it's solving a real pain point that people will pay money for. Right. I think oftentimes one of the pieces that gets confused a little bit with people in our world who want to have impact at the same time as they generate financial returns is that inherently there must be some sort of concessionary motive or, allowance that we're not in it to actually make money. And that's not actually true. I think it's pretty essential that if we want to have impact and really solve some problems that we think could have market-oriented solutions, none of that will work if it's not sustainable.
Sure.
It's really essential that people figure out a business model that can get a business off the ground and then hopefully take it to a very reasonable scale so that we have not just, local or sort of small impact, but are reaching thousands and millions of people and addressing some of these challenges that clearly aren't getting addressed right now based on how sort of status quo business operates or the limitations of government and philanthropy.
Yeah, totally. And look, maybe just to help kind of put some, really to clarify that for people listening, give me maybe one or two examples of the types of businesses that have been, super successful under that lens and in that model.
Absolutely. So, we're across a broad range of sectors, everything from renewable energy and sustainable food and agriculture to the future of work and education to inclusive finance to healthcare. just taking as one example, we're invested in a business called Remedy that's based in Atlanta, a former medical doctor who was really plagued by the notion of how much inefficiency she saw in how patients and providers of healthcare and payers of healthcare, so typically insurance companies and others, were interacting in a system around chronic disease management, and left the medical profession to form a company that would provide a tech-enabled solution to that problem. In in the US, we see chronic disease like diabetes and obesity and liver disease and others really be this sort of perfect storm of conditions that affects people across the population, but particularly dramatically lower wealth and lower income populations that are typically people of color. And there has to be a better way for them to get the right personalized type of care they need, to get the right communications from their healthcare providers, come up with individualized plans that will, better enable them to adhere to those prescriptions or medications. And I think for us, the challenge is, as we set out to try to impact some of these issue areas, they're not one simple problem. They're intertwined and interdependent with a lot of other aspects of somebody's life. If they have a really inflexible job or have to have multiple jobs, it's not easy for them to go to doctor's appointments all the time. Or if they, can't afford to maintain or own their own car and have to use a lot of public transportation to get to and from healthcare providers and to their place of work or where they live, what does that mean for their propensity to skip appointments if they're running late, or if, their child is sick and they need to stay home rather than go do something for themselves. So Remedy is a solution that addresses a subset of those things, but looks at the healthcare pieces fundamentally more holistically to say the way that we've treated some of these conditions in the past is really one size fits all. And the technology that Dr. Lucy Ide and her team have developed allows providers to better forecast through an algorithm that they developed. Okay, if these are your conditions and your sort of comorbidities, if we change XYZ in the medications that you're taking or certain aspects of your lifestyle, how will that affect your prognosis going forward? And doing that in a way that is really clearly communicated to patients. And I think she's an example of the type of founder who, has lived experience with the problem that she's trying to address from a really in-depth place of expertise. But she has such a fundamental human approach to it, and really cares about the fact that, in Atlanta where they're based, if you go across, county lines, you have completely different health outcomes.
I shouldn't be laughing, but I actually spent a bit of time in Atlanta. We had an office out there for a while, and I wasn't very flush at the time that I was having to go back and forth to visit that office. I had to stay in areas where literally walking on one side of a train line versus the other side of a train line was like 10 times difference in property value and, and income and all the rest of it. It was amazing. So I actually know that firsthand. I just want to come back to a couple of things here, because you talked there about lived experience, and I think it was going to be one of my questions. I think you often are finding founders who have been firsthand dealing with a certain challenge in a certain market. And, this is quite common in founders more broadly, even though it's not in the kind of the village capital mindset. But I think that's obviously a fundamental part of it. I guess I'm assuming that's some form of trait, but I just wanted to ask as well, is part of what's making this possible now is that the technology that can be built or can be, cobbled together. If it's not built, it might be multitudes of technologies combined. We're now at a point where you can solve these problems using technology at a scale which previously, maybe 10 years ago, would have either been impossible or so costly as to mean unfeasible. Is that part of what we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true, and to varying extents across the industries we work in. I think by and large, any sort of software-enabled business or tech broadly, but that means a lot of things to a lot of people. Just the costs for experimenting and taking a risk on a startup are so much lower than a few decades ago when you needed to really be making huge investments in your own servers and infrastructure to even be testing things. So I think that definitely is one of the enabling factors. And then I think just the narratives around startup success, kind of as distorted as they are in some parts of our view, that, a lot of things get celebrated that we think may not be the purest examples of what we'd like to see, have sort of shown a light on the potential of early stage businesses' ability to address some of these problems. And yet, I'll say as a huge caveat, we're seeing really, in terms of just the data out there, and I'll speak for the US in particular here, although we operate globally, a real decline in entrepreneurship.
Right.
One of the things that we've been thinking about is, how do we play a bigger role in making this seem like a viable opportunity for anybody that has a great idea and is willing to really work hard to achieve it. And I think what is really stark about that is that, it's very costly, as you well know, Vincent, having been in these shoes yourself in a few different instances now at this point. Like, the opportunity cost for taking the leap to be a founder is really quite high. It not only assumes that you can kind of afford to be in the lifestyle that might be pretty bare bones for a while as you're sort of vetting an idea and trying to get it off the ground, but it also assumes that you can afford to fail, and that, you're willing to take a risk on something that might not work out and still have a plan B that allows you to, put food on the table and a roof over your head. And if you have a family, to help provide for that family. And the amount of wealth inequality and access to networks and power that we've seen that is so disparate among populations, certainly in the US, but globally, has meant that choice really isn't available to everybody.
Yeah.
And so...
Oh, sorry, go
ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting that we had a chat to a gentleman a couple of weeks ago who has a startup studio in Africa, and he said for those people that coming in through his studio, there isn't a plan B. And, I often think, oh, what's the worst that can happen? You go back to work and you have a job. And in some cases, well, no, even having the job is part of it, or having 2 or 3 jobs and then thinking, this still isn't fulfilling me and I'm not working where I'd like to be applying my skills, and, wake up every day and be not just engaged, but also feel like I'm actually going to leave the planet better than when I found it, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, some investors certainly say, look, I want to find the profile of founder that doesn't have a plan B, because that is going to be the person who's willing to run through walls and, doesn't feel like they have a parachute. And I understand that point of view, certainly, and I get where it comes from, but it also sort of assumes that what's on the other side of that failure isn't a really stark option.
Yeah.
And that even if they fail, there's sort of a circular path where a certain type of demographic can wear failure as a real badge of honor, and for other people, it doesn't carry that connotation at all.
Yeah. Look, it's a balance. I think there's certainly something about having fire in the belly, as I call it, with regards to early stage and not sure how the thing's going to work, especially. And I think this will be really relevant to you and the cohort of founders who come through the program, especially when there's not a lot of clarity on the business model. I think when it's relatively straightforward how the business is going to work, then it's one, you make a product and people are going to buy that product and it's better than the other product. That's fine. But when you have these businesses that are either rethinking a business model or bringing an entirely new service to a class of people who haven't had it, or, potentially what the kind of thing we're doing at the moment, where, doing something in a new way with a new brand, that's infrequent and high value and highly emotional. There's a whole lot of variables that go into making that work. There's this huge amount of uncertainty in those businesses, and when you combine that with someone who says, "Well, I'm not sure how I'm going to pay for term for my child next quarter," there's less of those people willing to make those risks and take those jumps, I think.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
So, just in terms of that, you said you've always been going for 10 years, which is amazing. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
I'm curious from your perspective, not just with the founders specifically and their successes, but in terms of I mean, it's kind of a meta because you're creating and rethinking a system, but that is also enabling, founders and entrepreneurs and people to do the same. But with respect to Village Capital yourself, tell me about the kind of the big wins and the big kind of, losses, for want of a better word, that you've had in the last 9 years in actually rethinking the system that you're rethinking.
Yeah. So I think, we've been reflecting a little bit as we approach this anniversary and are just so grateful for the amazing sort of collective that we've gotten to work with, from founders to partners to investors to our teammates. And I think the big wins for us are really putting out there into the world a different approach to doing this and challenging some of the conversations that we see around early stage venture activity. And I think the things that we used to talk about that seemed pretty far out there to people are now getting much more mainstream attention. And so that is a huge win to us. We've seen peer review and peer selection as an approach to investment activity, while still sort of an outlier, as something we pioneered, be more broadly adopted across both a network that we've cultivated that we call VilCap communities, but also with some organizations that are farther afield from us that, have seen our work and brought it into their own. I think certainly we've seen, the rise of scout programs in mainstream venture funds adopt in a much larger scale than when we started 10 years ago, the approach that it just makes a ton of sense for founders who are actively out there trying to solve a problem within a given sector to also be catalyzing innovation and sort of taking some bets on who they think is going to succeed over time. And that concept, which seemed when we were out there in the early days sort of crazy to people, to say, how can you expect entrepreneurs to pick your investments? Like they're fundamentally a different, breed of operating style than an investor, has really gotten a lot more normal.
Can you actually just explain this? I think this is actually a foreign concept for a lot of people and not how most people imagine how investments happen. Can you just break that down for people, how this actually works?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on we're a little bit meta in a way, since we see ourselves as a force for innovation and we're backing innovators. But one of the things that we talk about quite a bit is that it's just doesn't make any sense to us that the process of venture capital really hasn't innovated itself at all for the past several decades, in spite of the fact that its entire success is predicated on finding the next great innovation. And for some reason, it's one of those sort of places of exceptionalism where you think that you don't need to be held to the same standard that you're holding your counterpart to. So we set up to create a system that would challenge some of that, and especially to focus on some of the inherent power dynamics that are part of early stage investing. And I think those are marked by a few things. One, the people doing all of the hard work that are closest to their customers, that are trying to solve these big problems, that are taking a ton of personal risk, are often sort of at the whim of the capital holders. And they don't have the same comfort or history with negotiating terms. They're not, seeing the same patterns out there in the market. They're meant to be full-time experts on running their business. And when it comes to actually getting the capital to do it, they're at a pretty big disadvantage. So we wanted to change some of that power dynamic and put entrepreneurs in the seat where they could actually themselves have a voice in what innovation got funded. And in the same process of evaluating a peer group of founders within the same given sector, learn a lot more about how investors were scrutinizing their own businesses so that they would have an advantage when they went into their next investor meeting. So for the last 10 years, clearly we've, it's been a long work in progress, but we've established a program where we take a batch of entrepreneurs at a time. We were thrilled to have you participate in one of those. And within a given sector, we work with those companies over the course of usually about 3 months, take them through our curriculum and methodology, and bring in a bunch of mentors and investors and advisors, but fundamentally operate from the belief that we think they, as founders, have a ton already to bring to the table and are more than capable and, in fact, uniquely qualified to evaluate each other against our investment criteria. Right. And then our fund takes their evaluations, and that's how we write our checks.
Right. Which is fascinating. And I think when you're actually in this process, in our case, there was 15 companies in a room, typically 1 to 2 founders per company. And it's basically a 4 days over every month for 3 months. And then you, at the end of that 4-day period on a category scale of 20 different categories from memory, you provide feedback, which is both visible and somewhat anonymous in terms of it's grouped up, and eventually you can trace it back from memory. And it's actually liberating, confronting, challenging, eye-opening. It was a fascinating and very different process. And at the end of that 3 months, then the checks that get written specifically out of that program are written based on the first and second, if from memory it was, or maybe the first.
Yep.
Yeah. So I love it. I'm glad you're still pushing it.
Very good memory.
Sorry, go.
Yeah, and we continue. We have continued to iterate on the process and criteria, and are trying to continue to hold ourselves to the same standard around innovation, and always taking in a lot of feedback from the founders who participate.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, just that's been, I think, a shining light, and I've seen even from the time that we were involved, seen the program pop up in Mexico City and a whole bunch of other places, and it's like, I think it's absolutely a model that can go beyond the US, and clearly it has. So there's been some wins there as well. I am still keen to understand, what have been, it doesn't have to be losses, but what have been the big roadblocks in this 10-year period as well?
Yeah, no, certainly. I missed that part, missed following up on that part of your question. I think there are certainly the day-to-day losses of we're working with very early stage companies. And so we sort of feel, we sometimes draw out this kind of entrepreneurial curve that I'm sure you would be a great artist of, that shows, the absolute exhilaration of how high the highs can be, where you feel like you're really meeting a need and getting a lot of traction. And then within, the span of a few hours can be in the depths of, is this ever going to work? Right. Or, and I think investors don't have quite that same amplitude, but we feel those same highs and lows through the companies that we are lucky to be partnered with. So I think certainly, with the amount of risk that we're taking, things don't always work, and that's part of the game, but it can feel really depleting when you believe in a team and believe they have the solution. And for whatever reason, market dynamics, technical risk, financing risk, when they don't get there, we live those losses too, and take them pretty hard. Yeah. I think the other piece is just still feeling like, even though, we have worked with now more than 1,200 entrepreneurs and have invested in more than 100 companies, like it still feels like we want to see the whole sector shift much faster than it has. Right. And I think that's some of the, impatience of optimists, as the Gates Foundation likes to talk about, that we want to see the world changing faster, and these aren't problems that we can afford to be moving slowly against. Yeah,
and look, I think it leads to a sort of a segue around. There's been plenty written about this. I think Ross, your co-founder, has also written about this in some respect. This challenge of systemic change, and it's part of the reason that we do this podcast. And I think there is absolutely it's challenging to actually change the way that things work, and whether that's a system of capital, or in a lot of cases when, and I would imagine this would be very specific to the founders in the Village Capital community, they're having to change things that are not just commercial change and even customer behaviour, but a lot of the time policy change and influencing the way decisions are made within the construct that they operate in. And I'm assuming that's an enduring challenge both for you and for the founders.
Absolutely. And we try to think about what types of resources they need really holistically. So we're not just focused on, okay, well, one of the main pain points of starting a new enterprise is clearly getting it funded. So we're just going to surround you with a bunch of investors, but instead really bringing in to the program a slate of customers that they can do hypothesis testing with and, demo their products for and iterate on them, and regulatory and policy experts that can sort of give them some of the guide rails, and they can figure out how to operate within the context of what the system looks like today, and hopefully influence where it's going on the margin, depending on the industries that they're in. But it does take a lot of people who are really bought into the same type of change happening. And I think, particularly when you see some of the sort of community rhetoric and political environment we're in be as divided as it is today, sure, it can feel difficult to get everybody moving in the same direction.
Yeah. And look, I think a part of it may not be necessarily trying to change, a system. Like at the moment, I'm inputting to policy around domain names in Australia, and clearly that's not, life-changing, world-changing stuff. But even helping a founder or an entrepreneur to understand that you should be interacting with policy. Policy is one of the foundations and the pillars that enables you to operate in the way that you do. And I think Elizabeth Warren talks about this quite well in terms of you might grow a business and employ people. And we thank you for that, but, you still drive on the road. I'm paraphrasing terribly, I realise. Yeah. So I think being cognizant and present with regards to these other factors and these constructs that exist around you is something that, people shouldn't take lightly. And I think a big part of playing in systems change, whether that's in energy or health or food or financial independence or security or equality, all involve some interaction with public policy.
Yeah.
Changing gears just a little bit. You've been running at this for 10 years or close to, but how did you arrive at doing this?
If I can remember that far back. So I mean, going way, way back, I think it was definitely part of our kind of family makeup that my parents, I think, did, to their credit, a great job of showing us that the world was a lot bigger than our sort of tiny bubbles, right, and that it's fine to try to, build things for yourself and pursue your interests, but that is pretty short-term fulfilling, and that the stuff that really makes the life long-term fulfilling is being part of something that's much bigger than yourself and working to change things for the better. And I think that was, really a value through a lot of kind of service orientation and being part of a community that they spent a lot of time thinking about. But as I went to school and sort of off on my own, started getting much more interested in kind of a global perspective and studied international relations and spent time in different countries. And it was just increasingly so bothersome to me to realize how much of the privilege that I had enjoyed growing up in a place that was safe and economically stable and had plentiful opportunity was a total lottery of birth. And so much of the trajectory of your life gets determined in such a haphazard way, and advantage and disadvantage compounds from such an early age. And I think, that's certainly true in the US, but is very true globally. Right. So that was part of why, I studied the things that I did in school, and I pursued a fellowship that really was focused on international development coming out of school, and then tried to get some investment skills within traditional private equity to figure out how capital markets worked and how things could be funded better. Yeah, it was a pretty big 180 from moving from Uganda to New York at the beginning of the financial crisis to do that. And then knew that, getting those skills, I would want to go back to finding a way to really move capital into markets where I thought we could solve some of these much larger, more fundamental issues about social inequality and environmental sustainability. And went to business school after I did the job in private equity, had another brief detour to East Africa to work on an ag fund, spent a few months at the Gates Foundation on one of their investment teams. And then coming out of grad school, Ross and I met through a variety of mutual friends, and we're talking about a lot of the same things. He had been working on the ideas of Village Capital and had just started spinning them out of a family office. Right. Then that starts the last 10 years, and we've evolved quite a bit over that stretch.
Totally got it. And was in that time frame, was there some kind of, I mean, it sounds like you've been on this arc for a while. It wasn't, this kind of cliched moment where someone says, I was sitting at a desk and I realized I wanted to do more with my life. Like there's clearly been an arc of a story for a while, but inside of that, were there like moments or stretches where you had kind of very specific inspiration or reassurance or reaffirmation of that direction?
Yeah. So I think, the themes certainly feel like they've been there for a long time. And I try to be cognizant of the fact that it's very easy to tell these stories in reverse in a way that makes them sound like they, were so perfectly planned out. I definitely had a lot of moments of like career anxiety and what am I going to do next along the way. But I think early on, I definitely had this conviction around international development, working on hard problems, doing something that felt bigger than just trying to make money, but probably thought that I would do it more in a nonprofit or even international law type of setting. I took the LSAT, was planning to go to law school, and then actually spent some time during the fellowship I had at the International Criminal Court, which would have been, my sort of dream job, and realized that was not at all going to be, after I spent some time there, the thing I actually wanted to do long term. In another sort of chapter of that same year, worked in microfinance in conflict zones of Western Kenya and Northern Uganda, and kept feeling like I was running up against the same stumbling blocks that were sort of within the NGO, nonprofit, and aid context of international development. And that was definitely one of the moments that I took a step back and sort of had the thought of, there is a way to solve some of these problems about getting people who have been through absolutely horrible disruption to their lives back on their feet economically, and that don't have to put them on this kind of revolving door cycle of aid. And I think that has something to do with building businesses. And if I could figure out how to invest in those kinds of businesses, that's something I think I could be passionate about doing for a really long time. And that is what prompted that big 180 from, a very different day-to-day setting to New York to try to get a job in finance so that I could learn how to be an investor, because I never had before.
Yeah, I love it. And it's, I think what's interesting as well is that, typically the chart of an entrepreneur or a founder, and I'm talking about you in this context, not the people within the Village Capital, is one where there's kind of an itch that they want to scratch, and then they just go and start working on the problem. And your take there was to identify that to really have an impact here, or to work in this problem space, there was a set of skills you needed to get first, and best to go out and understand that, to be kind of brash in some respects on someone else's dime, so that you could go and get well-versed in how this whole universe worked, and then work out how and where you needed to play in that space.
Yeah, again, I think, easy to attribute a lot of planning and foresight to it. I was lucky that it worked out the way that it did, and it didn't happen immediately. Sure. I definitely remember moving to New York with this plan and then feeling pretty defeated for a few months while I couldn't get anybody to take a chance on me, having, just moved from Uganda, never having worked at an investment bank during a summer of college, and have a lot of credit to give to the firm that took a chance on me. And they really did it because they saw, if you can live in a bunch of different cultures and sort of figure out how to make yourself useful, and you look like you can learn things pretty quickly, like investing is not rocket science. Right. And I think a lot of people feel sort of intimidated by it before they sort of get behind the other side of the curtain and realize that, if you can think about sort of quantitative problems at a pretty basic level, you don't need to be able to do calculus to make good investments.
It's a different type of problem solving. Totally. Just sort of thinking more broadly around that. So, I mean, you operate in a space where you encounter on a pretty regular basis within Village Capital, specifically people working on super inspiring and challenging problems and solving really interesting things. From your perspective, like, what are the kind of the 5 or 6 big problem areas that you see, or what I like to call first order problems, that you think that we collectively should be working on? And even outside of Village Capital, I'd love to hear about 1 or 2 people who you think are doing some really interesting or amazing stuff in those problem areas.
First and foremost, it feels like the climate change issue is just something that is becoming clearer and clearer by the day, nearly, what an existential sort of threat we're up against. It's fall here in California, which now means that it's the season that we're getting used to there being just terrible annual wildfires. And it's to the point where you can smell smoke in San Francisco again, and they're having to do air quality alerts. I know that, you have had a rash of those in Australia as well. And I don't know how much clearer the warning signs need to be for us to take really seriously what an existential threat this is to our planet. And it is going to hurt the most vulnerable populations the hardest. So that's certainly one place that we focus on in the work that we do around renewable energy and sustainable food and agriculture. But I'm really inspired by other organizations that I think are really active on a very large scale in this space. Things like Project Drawdown that are, focused on gigaton reductions in CO2 emissions, whereas the founders that we're working with and the stage that we interact with tend to be much more focused on, capital efficient solutions that we think will have really large impacts, but that will take a lot of those types of solutions.
Understood.
To make a big
in some respects, climate change is now, I might be drawing a long bow here, but it's somewhat of an umbrella term as well, to say it's a whole bunch of things we're doing that are causing problems with the climate, but it's also a spectrum of things where we're not very good at producing the things we need without destroying the thing that produces it. And that could be the water, it could be the soil, it could be the food where we need it, or the ground that it lives in, or the water that it gets, created in. I think there's often a temptation for people to sort of look at a particular thing and say, well, that's what that thing is, and I'm not sure about that thing, ignoring that really there's a lot of intertwined issues that all account to our being here and our necessity to consume things that enable us to be here, and the way in which we achieve that.
Yep. No, I think it's back to the idea of how intertwined all of these issues are, not just on the environmental front, but also on a lot of the social and the social and sort of economic issues that we talk about. I think on that front, and in the U.S., we're facing a big demographic shift where people are living much longer and have not thought about sort of how to afford that change. We're, I think 75% of the U.S. can't meet an unexpected $400 or $500 expense. And we're having people who, are going to live longer, are going to need much more healthcare, and are not financially equipped to do it. And right now we don't have the full safety net that we need to provide for them. So we're going to need a lot of pretty innovative solutions to figure out how we get there without a lot of pain across a huge part of the population. That again goes back to there are definitely some policy issues that need to change to better support that. But we think there are also some market opportunities that innovative companies that have people's interest at heart can come up with better ways to provide some safety net.
I think, and just sort of dwelling on this for a moment, because I think that this financial inequality is a big thing globally, and the US is actually somewhat surprisingly, but somewhat unsurprisingly, a global leader in financial inequality. I'm saying that tongue in cheek to a degree. But I do remember, I think the core VC guys talking about how expensive it is to be poor in the US. And I think where you look at a market where there is a mispricing of services, and the one that I tend to come back to is retail financial banking. And I remember hearing arguments from kind of far up in, certain large banks, that it's not worth trying to provide financial services to, the 100 million people or however many it is who are unbanked or underbanked. And I'm like, I don't understand how a business that could have 100 million customers who, might give you all of their money, even if that's somewhere between a couple of $1,000s and sub $10,000, wouldn't be a profitable business.
Mm-hmm.
Like most businesses would kill to have that type of customer exposure if they worked out the unit economics of their business properly.
Yep. Yeah, I think, we at a bunch of different levels, and we probably could spend a whole nother time just talking about this, but have thought about the number of things that don't get solved because people sometimes incorrectly assume that small scale will never work. And that's one of the challenges that our fund sought out to disprove was, a lot of, especially outside of the US, a lot of innovation doesn't get funded because people are like, oh, it's just too expensive to write a 25, 50, 100K check. And to do that, you need a small fund, and small funds can't pay for themselves because, 2% management fees off of a small fund size doesn't get you anywhere. Right. And so there's these, ripple on structural issues that people say like, oh, well, that's just how the system works. And one of the things that we've really tried to make a dent in is re-envisioning how that system should work, coming up with ways that it could be more efficient so that for opportunities like those, hundreds of millions of people who are underbanked, or innovators that have ideas and yet can't even get their first check because there's nobody who thinks that it's, efficient to write those small checks, do find somebody to believe in them.
Just probably, as you said, we probably could talk for a while because there's a whole bunch to unpack here. I'll probably close out with one quick question, and I think this is something I like to ask, in that in solving for systemic problems and being sort of close to just, first order problems generally, I tend to ask people how they reconcile that, how they find, balance for themselves. Like, what is it that you're doing on a day-to-day basis to keep yourself grounded and to not get too caught up in it all?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I try to spend more time outside. So to the extent that I can, take a walk while I'm doing a meeting or be outside on the phone, I have found that it definitely helps me feel a lot calmer. I think there's tons of data out there about nature deficit and what horrible effects it's having on general anxiety and other mental health issue levels. So I try to get outside. I would like to do that more. I'm lucky that I live in a part of California that has a lot of natural beauty. So that helps. Certainly reading is one of the few hobbies that I've been able to maintain as my life continues to get a lot busier with 2 young kids and work and family and all that comes with it. But I definitely do get a lot of pleasure and peace from kind of
hugging a tree.
Yeah, hugging a tree, reading a book, taking my mind off of the day-to-day work that can sometimes seem overwhelming, and frankly, the number of other problems that our work doesn't even touch that I'm, impressed and grateful that a lot of other people pursue. But in addition to those things and trying to exercise now and then when I can, certainly spending time with my family and with my kids who continue to see wonder in a lot of parts of the world that I have, as an adult, taken for granted. They're a great reminder every day that as much as we can feel overwhelmed by everything that we need to work on, there's a lot of joy and things that are pretty awesome all around us.
Perfect. We'll leave it there for today. Victoria, it was an absolute pleasure and really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much, Vincent.